Paul bent over the letter and with his own hand penned its close. Then it was rolled and covered with an outer case to protect it from damage in travelling. The messenger, probably his trusted Greek friend Titus, would thrust it into his tunic and go down the portway to the harbour, to carry across the water to Corinth words that will be read till the end of time. In that letter Paul said that he hoped to start on a journey around the coasts of the Aegean Sea, visiting Philippi and Thessalonica and Beroea, till he came to them in Corinth itself. But a great riot occurred which threw all his plans out and hastened his journey. It came about thus. Each year as a springtime was changing to full summer, on a certain morning in May, the streets of Ephesus began to fill with crowds of holiday-making country people who had come down on foot or by ass or camel from the river valleys of Asia. With them came merchants and shopkeepers, officials and students, from the cities of Lycus and Meander and Castor valleys, while the ships that crept into the port brought pilgrims from all along the coast and even from Greece and Macedonia across the Aegean Sea. The whole country made holiday in honour of Artemis, the goddess of wild nature, now partly Asian and partly Greek in character. The people crowded to see the chariots race round the stadium on the hill, drawn by horses frenzied by the cracking whips of the drivers and the shouts of the crowd. Wrestlers, their bodies glistening with oil in the blazing sun, and boxers with iron-studded gloves on their knuckles, strained and struggled. Men ran the foot races for the prize of a wreath. Hungry beasts, lions from Africa and tigers from the East, were let loose on the sanded arena of the stadium to fight with gladiators standing with their short swords drawn. In the theatre actors played comic plays of Aristophanes before the hill of faces that surrounded them, the audience which crowded the seats that rose tier above tier in the vast auditorium. Paul heard the blare of trumpets and the clash and boom of cymbal and drum, and saw the multitude press out toward the Magnesian gate of the city. The priests and priestesses of Artemis came in procession, with some slaves, playing the music and others bearing aloft under canopies statues of the great goddess. As these passed by, the people waved their arms and gave a shout that surged to the very skies, "Great Artemis! Great Artemis of Ephesus!" Through the streets the goddess in symbol made her triumphal way to the theatre, where play was made in her honour. She came out again and was borne forward on the shoulders of men above the shouting crowds, toward the gate by Mount Coressus, and back through the groves of green trees, above which could be seen the broad, ridged roof of the wonderful temple built for her worship. As the procession drew nearer to the Artemision, the people saw a lovely white temple. Its wide roof and portico rested on row behind row of marble pillars, whose carved capitals were overlaid with gold and whose vast size was made graceful and light by their exquisite proportions. Climbing the marble steps that surrounded and raised the temple, the worshippers went barefoot out of the blaze of the sunshine, through the massive carven doors of cypress wood, into the cool dim quiet of the great hall of the temple with its many statues. Beyond which lay the inner holy place, with its roof of golden cased cedar resting on priceless pillars of green jasper, its carven altar, its embroidered curtain behind which was concealed the goddess Artemis herself, who had fallen, they said, from heaven. She was never shown to the people, a dark roughly carved image with no beauty. Out into the city, however, Paul could see men were buying little graven or terracotta images of Artemis in her shrine, some to take back to their homes to worship, others to present as a votive offering at the Artemision, the temple itself. For 4 days the great festival of Artemis was celebrated each Maytime, and then the crowds melted away, going back along a score of roads and across the sea. But all through the year in the booths in the marketplace sat men who were moulding and carving and hammering. They were making the little shrines (naoi) of Artemis, sitting in a niche, with her lions couched by her side. Here the sculptor carved the figures in pure marble from Mount Coressus. By his side a man with agile, clever fingers moulded them in clay that was put into the furnace and baked. Some of the finished terracotta shrines stood beside him. In the silversmiths' guild men sat by their tiny forges with little hammers and anvils, on which they tapped the grey silver and molded it to beautiful little images of Artemis. Many men in Ephesus made their living by these handicrafts, and sold their shrines not only in Ephesus and on the feast day, but all up the Lycus, Castor and Meander valleys, and at places like Sardis, Philadelphia, Pergamos and Thyatira, Hierapolis, Laodicea and Colossae, for all Asia worshipped Artemis of Ephesus. A leader among these silversmiths was named Demetrius. As he saw Paul, with his helpers Aquila and Timothy, and Erastus, Gaius and Aristarchus and others, spreading through Asia their new religion, which said that handmade images of gods had no power and ought not to be worshipped, Demetrius saw that his income from the shrines would fall in proportion as Paul succeeded. He did not stop to ask himself whether what Paul said was or was not true. He only saw that these new worshippers of the God whom they called Christ were growing in numbers and in power all over the city, and that men who had in the old days bought shrines of Artemis now bought them no longer. Swiftly, one winter day, he drew the leading craftsmen together, the silversmiths, the sculptors in wood and marble and clay, perhaps in the guild of the silversmiths where he was a leading employer. When they were met together, he stood up and spoke. "My men," he said, "you know this trade is the source of our wealth. You also see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but almost all over Asia, this fellow Paul has drawn off a considerable number of people by his persuasions. He declares that handmade gods are not gods at all. Now the danger is not only that we shall have our trade discredited, but that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will fall into contempt, and that she will be degraded from her majestic glory, she whom all Asia and the wide world worship." Demetrius, by thus artfully playing both on their trade interest and their pride in Ephesus as the centre for Artemis worship, roused the meeting to fury against Paul. They poured out into the street shouting, in their passion of enthusiasm for Artemis and rage against the new way, "Great Artemis of Ephesus!" they shouted as they crowded into the street. The people leapt from their shops and houses. Sailors ran up the portway from the harbour, smiths threw down their tools, boys left their games to find out the cause of the uproar. They could only discover that the worship of their goddess was threatened, so they all joined in the cry. There was a shout of "To the theatre!" The dust rose in the air above the many-coloured moving mob that pushed and jostled and yelled its way to the theatre, which was close by the market-place. As the leaders headed the throng they caught sight of Gaius and Aristarchus of Macedonia, two of Paul's principal helpers, who had been busy spreading the faith in Asia. "There are two of the ringleaders," one would cry. "Away with them!" They rushed at Gaius and Aristarchus, and dragging them by their arms and pushing them along, they surged down the street and crowded like a full flowing tide into the theatre, clambering up the marble steps and over the seats, till the place was alive with faces of all nations, Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, Cretans, men of Asia, even Jews. Paul heard the uproar and found that his friends Gaius and Aristarchus had been dragged into the theatre. Immediately he started to go to the theatre himself, to face the raging mob, regardless of the peril. Some of his disciples at once came round Paul and held him back. We can imagine their argument. "Do not go. You are our leader. All the churches depend upon you, and you must keep yourself for the sake of us all. Besides that, what good would come if you went in among those raging beasts? The sight of you would only sting Demetrius and all his men to a wilder fury, which the excitable mob of an Ionian coast city like this would wreak on Aristarchus and Gaius as well as on you." As Paul was hesitating, messengers came running to him from some of the Asiarchs, the great officials who were the high priests for all Asia, of the worship of the divine majesty of Rome itself, in the persons of emperor and the whole line of Caesars. These great Roman-spirited officers were friends of Paul and did not wish any harm to come to him. Knowing that Paul never cared for his own safety, and fearing that he would rush into the theatre and be torn to pieces, they sent to him, saying, "Do not imperil your life by coming into the amphitheatre." Paul at last reluctantly gave way. In the theatre din and chaos ruled. Everyone was shouting, some yelling one thing, some another. The majority had no idea why they had met. At last the Jews, fearing that the mob would turn against them as the class known to be opposed to all carving of graven images, pushed to the front Alexander, a leading Jew. He stood on the stage beckoning with his hand to get silence, so that he could defend himself against the cries of the people. For a few seconds there was quietness. Then the mob discovered that the speaker was a Jew, and a roar broke out from them all, so that not a word that he said could be heard. "Great Artemis of Ephesus!" they shouted, turning a prayer into a rallying cry. "Great Artemis of Ephesus!" For 2 hours that cry echoed from the theatre across the city to the harbour. At last, when they were exhausted, the Secretary of State of Ephesus, the ruling official who was in close touch with the proconsul from Rome, stood up, and at last got complete silence. "Men of Ephesus," he began with a touch of flattery that secured their hearing, "who on earth does not know that the city of Ephesus is warden of the temple of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? All that is beyond question. So you should keep calm and do nothing reckless. Instead of that," he continued, pointing to Gaius and Aristarchus, "you have brought these men here who are guilty neither of sacrilege nor of blasphemy against our goddess. If Demetrius and his fellow tradesmen have a grievance against anybody, let both parties state their case. The assizes are held, and there are such persons as proconsuls to give judgment. Any wider claim must be settled by the legal assembly of the citizens. Indeed," he concluded, "there is a danger of our being charged with a riot over today's meeting. There is not a single reason that we can give for this disorderly gathering. Now go your ways." At this the people began to pour out from the theatre, arguing, laughing, angry and ashamed by turns. When the tumult in the city had quieted down, Paul called his disciples together round him. In the quietness he talked with them about the work that lay before them in Ephesus and other cities of Asia. He had been with them now for over 2 years, speaking daily in the philosophy school called after Tyrannus, writing letters, sending his helpers out into other cities. Till now there were not only many churches among the cities, but there were men who could lead and carry forward the work that he had opened up. He had intended to stay till that spring, and then to sail in the late spring at Pentecost, going round by Philippi and Thessalonica to Corinth, as he had promised them in his letter. But the riot made his own work in Ephesus impossible for the time. Paul had never since his call from Tarsus stayed so long in one place as Ephesus, and in no place had the opportunity been so wonderful. But he felt the spirit of the pioneer stirring in him, the thrill that stung him on to run the full course, on to his goal. It was winter, with the mountains and hills above Ephesus etched in white snow against the dark sky, and away to the west the pearly sea of islands. The Great Sea was not open for journeying, but venturesome sailors could run the gauntlet of the storms in short voyages from port to port up the coast. Paul, therefore, went down to the harbour and took passage in a coasting vessel. She was rowed down river, then the sweeps were drawn in, and with sail hoisted, she leapt out over the grey waste of waters with her bows northward. End of chapter 26.